Blood satellite.
Yeah, because there was this meme floating around. It was just like some interview. It was with Henry Cavill, and he's in an interview, and it's like, who should have the land, Israel or Palestine? And he goes, Rome. And I said, yeah, what the fuck? Fuck your framing. Like, who, Israel, Palestine? I'm like, how about Her Majesty? How about fucking, how about France? How about France takes over? I don't give a fuck. How about anyone except Israel and Palestine? How about us?
Give
Fuck
it to
you.
somebody who just doesn't want it and has no idea what to do with it, like Madagascar or New Zealand or something. They're like, no, we don't want it. It's like, no, it's yours now.
Yeah.
It's like, no, please.
Oh, Israel, Palestine, which side? How about Liechtenstein, nigger? How about fucking Switzerland? You fucking slave. You person who is trafficked.
Let's give it to Mongolia.
Give it to fucking Mongolia. Second, Judas coin is going to the moon right now. Let me just say that. And I say that as someone who dumped it all. I do not stand to gain anything from saying this. I am not. I am slippery eel hands on Judas coin. This is going to the moon because, give it to, why not Mongolia? They deserve another go at it.
It's been 1,000 years.
Like you're pissed off at China. What do you think China's going to do if Mongolia is in the holiest place on earth? just keep it interesting, right? Explain that to someone of any race. They're going to want to see what happens. But yeah, like my policy, and this is the second part of my long chain of takes. But I remember I started seeing some memes circulating targeting this position because my position was I don't like either side. And I started seeing like a soy jack is with a soy face, but this was like a snoot jack. It was like a pretentious, self-obsessed, obviously a fat, ugly ape creature, but he's like, actually both sides are bad. They took the thing that I was saying and made a snoot jack out of it.
They can't do that.
Meet Dimes.
They can't do that. No.
The Constantine of Cope and Sneed. They're fucking chud soy fucking snoot jack and me.
You cannot soy jack us. There are rules.
And I didn't appreciate that.
Every day's a bad day. Every night's a nightmare.
There's acting out of pocket, and then there's this. I do not deserve this. And I honestly, and to be real though, to me, like saying that I want both sides to lose, what they will tell you, I'm going to steelman the position, I think, of the people who are saying that. It's like, well, you need to figure out where your self-interest lie. If your self-interest is against Israel, and also if your self-interest is nationalism, here seems to be a nationalist cause in the form of Palestine. So as a nationalist, you must support all other national uprisings or nationalist uprisings throughout the world. It's third worldism through and through. And I don't subscribe to that. I know a fucking Nazbol third worldist fucking bullshit argument when I hear it, and I'm not falling for it again. You're not going to, because they wouldn't see themselves as nationalists anyway. They do not fit into our paradigms. They don't fit into our definitions. So like my self-interest is reflected neither in Israel or Palestine, and you're not going to fucking convince me otherwise. Because, you know, people say like, oh, no Palestinian ever called me a goy. Well, they call you an infidel. They also rape their way across Europe. Like you are not going to convince me of siding with Muslims. You're not. No. And anyone who's convincing you otherwise should be suspicious of, frankly, because they haven't thought about it through. Because also you have to think, I think if I'm going to say this, when people would say, you know, you need to support the Palestinians, why? Well, you must amplify their message because you want to win a strategic victory, as momentary as it might be, against Israel. And chiefly, I would say that what's interesting is that Israel, to my mind, is experiencing an all-time low of public approval, not only from the political right broadly, but also the left, like the progressives, have been beating the drum against Israel for decades now. A lot of leftists are, a lot of communists are. They will say it's an apartheid state. They hate Israel because it's colonial. The right hates Israel insofar as it does hate Israel because it's Jews. Liberals are indifferent, and we're kind of engaged in a war for the liberal mind right now. But the only people who love Israel are conservatives, American conservatives. But you're not going to find many other groups that are really in favor of Israel, and I think a lot of Jews know this. And so to me, it's like, well, what does the right actually bring to the table? Because we are in the midst of losing this sort of narrative. Like the right has been anti-Israel for a long time, and it's had a lot of very well-reasoned and measured arguments against Israel. And my concern is that if we just throw in behind the Arabs and say they're the champions of anti-Israeli sentiment, then that's just another battle we're going to lose, that we will surrender to an enemy which would rape and kill us any other day of the week. Like, you want to talk about the friend-enemy distinction? Most people don't understand the friend-enemy distinction. We did a whole video on Carl Schmitt's, the concept of the political and the friend-enemy distinction. I don't think people truly have the ability to delineate between existential enemies and just political enemies. I think they see Muslims as like existential allies and only political enemies, and in reality it's reversed. Like, they are through and through Europe's existential enemy. They're like, the more power you grant to them, it will come at the cost of Europe. And I see people like presenting me again with a strange framing where it's like, okay, which side do you want to pick? If Israel loses, that means 2 million Jews are going to flood into Europe. If Palestine loses, that means it's going to be 7 million Palestinians that flood into Europe. So which one do you want to pick? Do you want Jews or Palestinians? Or do you want the status quo? And I'm like, I once again return to neither of these outcomes are in my self-interest.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear what you think about this, because what I would say to dissidents and people on the dissident right is that these are arguments from a prey position. These are arguments where you don't have a seat at the table. You are merely throwing in with one enemy you think is better than your other enemy. It's not. Both of them want to destroy you. Both of them want to sexually humiliate you. Any power granted to the Muslim world will be wielded against Europe and white people. And anyone telling you any different needs to be treated with the utmost fucking hostility.
Yes, absolutely. Don't be so hungry for approval and like networking and friendship and being, having a right opinion, that you go along with somebody who just step back for a second, use your grug brain, your lizard brain, and just look at what the guy's saying. Is he essentially just saying Israel cool? Well, Freddie, that's not true. So how about we just zip his lips, turn it off, tell him to go fuck himself. Just don't even engage. There's a whole world of people out there that you could listen to and read from and interact with without having to ever sit across the table from somebody who is promoting Israel. You don't need to, right? Stop giving them the time of day. This should be a hard, fast rule. If they have even an inkling of support for Judaism, the Jews, or Israel, out the door, gone. It's over. Don't want to hear it.
Sorry, I was going to say, like, if they do that, just be aware that they're not going to be in favor of your thing. That's going to be their thing that will always supersede whatever it is. So if you want to work with them, just be aware of that. That's what I was kind of starting with. I'm like, I don't need to believe that they're the architect of all world events, but I know where their allegiances lie. I know what they like to do. I know what historically they have done. So I'm always going to keep them in that bucket. And at least they're open about it. But like, I know what I get with them. So I'm not going to...
Yeah. Which is to say they're not trustworthy. They can never be trusted. So, and this is the thing. It's like, well, I mean, I know he's not trustworthy on that issue, but we can still cooperate on X, Y, and Z. No, honestly, unless you're extremely desperate, you really should not and cannot, because it's only a matter of time before you get burned.
Like, ask the next guy who wants you to side with Israel and Israeli nationalism. Ask them what they think about European nationalism. Do they all of a sudden have a lot of caveats and asterisks and concerns about what that means? Yeah, yeah, exactly. So like this is just another false dichotomy
Yeah.
that you're being corralled into. And aren't you sick of being corralled into false dichotomies? Don't you feel powerless? Don't you feel like you're just being used as a propagandistic resource? And so I guess the point we're getting to is like, let's, because here's the thing I was going to get to, which is that you ask yourselves, do either of these parties serve my interest as a group, as an identity, whatever that identity may be? What most people struggle with is they don't know what their self-interest is. Within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they've already admitted it's a lose-lose scenario. They don't have an ideal situation in this conflict. They just picked less bad. That's it. So what we're trying to get people to think is like, we need to start thinking about what is our actual ideal outcome, what is our blue sky scenario, and how can we actually get to work that instead of always falling for these individuals who are just trying to present you a false dichotomy to effectively get you on their side. And there's this book that I read recently that kind of ties into this that I thought was very, very interesting. And it's quite long, but it's written in such a way that I can kind of explain it pretty quickly. And there's some things I liked about this book, some things I didn't like about this book, but I think of the things that we've covered, I think this will give people a lot to think about. And it ties directly into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, which is why I think that's a very, very highly advanced, highly skilled segue I just executed.
Nice.
The book is called The Network State. It's by Balaji Srinivasan. I don't know if that's a real name or a fake name. If it's real, damn, that sucks.
Sounds
Anyway,
fake.
it's a pretty good book. If I had to summarize this book, it's like an NRX book. NRX, neo-reactionary. So if you're familiar with your Curtis Yarvins, you're familiar with a lot of the sort of dissident right figures who are more into the technocratic side of things. They're more into, I wouldn't say this is Nick Land. I wouldn't even say this is like Bronze Age pervert, even though they're in the same kind of milieu. But there's a subset of people, the people who think that, America should be run by a CEO, a tech CEO, those types of people. And it's a very tech-friendly book. So if you are agnostic on technology or critical of it, you might not like this as much, but I think if you kind of parse through what's being said and not some of the language, you'll find a lot to like. Like, I'll give you one example of something I found annoying in this book. It's unforgivably internet poisoned in the sense that on more than one occasion it uses the word LARP.
Oh no.
And this is a serious book, or it's supposed to be a serious book. It's well written, it's well formatted. It's like 262 pages. It's not some fucking, blog pamphlet, but it uses the word LARP, live action role playing, and it uses it in the internet sort of way. And anytime there's a book that uses the word LARP, I take it less seriously. Maybe that's unfair.
Of course. No, that's very reasonable.
But essentially, it's tackling the issue that we've talked about just on this episode as well, which is that a lot of the world events that we see, a lot of the conflicts are not being done necessarily by state actors, but more often groups that seem to span across multiple states. And this is like we talked about the clash of civilizations and the remaking of the world order, how it's not so much Western countries, but the West in aggregate. And what we're seeing is sort of the formation of the East in aggregates with the BRICS nations forming, and that we're trying to see which civilizational connections exist, not just state borders or nation states. It could come to pass that the nation state as we know it is a very 20th century idea. Maybe with the proliferation of technology, we're allowed to form stronger bonds over wider areas of terrain, and something like political Islam can exist as a decentralized but homogenous network that spans not only the Middle East, but also into Europe as well. That's a pan-state phenomenon. in the same way the West can do that as well, and the same way China can do that as well. Like we're seeing the states be more of like a guide and not like a hard and fast borders anymore.
The thing is that I'm downloading one of about, I don't know how many, 10, 15 different things that turn constants into variables. One of them is the nation that we take for granted, the single group of people, is breaking up into multiple nations that are defined by networks. Another is the currency is breaking up. Okay. A third is the geography is changing. A fourth is the moral principles that underpin society are changing. And so when like all of those things are in flux, you kind of need something to catch it on the other side, because otherwise what people will do is they will sort of try to assert that old thing that just doesn't exist anymore. And that'll be like something that does not acknowledge the reality of the situation. It's like opening the, closing the barn door and then expecting to get all the horses back inside when there were forces that were more powerful than that thing that spread them all out, that those entropic forces. You have to kind of go to where those horses are and loop them up and maybe have new ranches or whatever there to extend the metaphor.
He proposes the network society. Is there a society, an actual society, a society that can be taken seriously, that exists with beyond the states, beyond the traditional states? Can you start a society online, on the internet, and have all of the benefits of a real state government society, right? And he lays out the schematic for this. And I'll kind of give you the headlines here, and then I'll go into the specific components, because he's very, very clear about what this is. That's what I appreciate about this book. It's very technical. So you want to know how to do it? Here's the 5 steps, and here's why. It's not easy. Not anyone can do it, but I think this ties most directly into the last episode in the last clip we had, which was with the square and the tower, which is all about the importance of secret societies and intellectual movements and clandestine, shadowy groups throughout human history in causing revolutions, causing intellectual movements, the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, any revolution you've heard of, right? And so, but how do these sort of decentralized affiliations work? How did the American Revolution work? It was almost like an affiliation network. And that's what's interesting about America. And America is almost an example of how this affiliation network literally became a country. But now it's like, well, how do you do that in 21st century where there's nukes and everyone's watching you, where there is no land, really. You can't just go somewhere and set up shop. So, all right, so here's how he defines it. A network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. That's like the one sentence description of what it is. And he kind of unfolds that throughout the book. He says, a network state is ideologically aligned, but geographically decentralized. Right, which is the phenomenon we start to see now with another example, like the Palestinian movement, like the Palestinian fight against Israel is calling to its support all of the Islamic territories around it in one form or another, and it didn't even really need to ask it; it just kind of happened. It was assumed that would happen, right? Like that's a miraculous thing, and that's something, interestingly, that the West is increasingly unable to do.
Insofar as, the network state is sort of like, it's a toolbox where you don't have to agree with my problem statement or my solution statement. My problem statement is, I think we're vectoring towards what I call American anarchy and Chinese control. My solution statement is, I think that rather than just centralization versus decentralization, I think we are going to need to see re-centralization on the other side, not in the coercive sense of, top-down control, but consensual regrouping around hubs. Just like, when people exit a burning building when it's on fire, what do? There's an assembly point, right? They re-centralize. And even if the building is being burned down, they're going to build something else together again, right? That is different than scattering to the four winds, everybody running for their life and never seeing each other, right? There was value in having that group together. But if that building's on fire, you decentralize and then you re-centralize. And so my proposed solution is, if these existing central points, especially the US establishment in China, are getting much worse. And we have this decentralizing technology, then we can build new societies and eventually new states.
And that was outlined in Peter Zeihan's book, Disunited Nations, that the real breakdown of the West might have very well come when America tried to bring everyone, all of its allies, into the Middle East, and very few of them wanted to go down that road with them. And it showed that, it didn't have the alignment in the West that it thought it had. And that was a big deal. So a network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency factors into this quite a bit, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. So I'll unpack that in a second, but what you'll notice is in this design, the blockchain is very, very important to this. And it's from a very libertarian-minded sort of guy, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. This is something you've heard a lot of libertarian circles talk about, and maybe some of this will sound familiar to you, Judas, because I know you used to travel in these circles. But instead of a constitution, we have a smart contract. We have this sort of this. It's not an AI, but it's like a blockchain government to help prevent tyranny and try and enshrine this populism. Does this sound familiar at all to you?
Yeah, pretty much. There's a lot of ANCAP stuff runs on this model. I think this has been attempted. I think there are kind of experimental communities around today which use something like this model.
Yeah, they would probably be what he would describe as network unions, because a network union is kind of this network of people who create a parallel society. We're always talking about parallel societies. That's what that is. But then the transition comes when you go from a network union to a network archipelago. A network archipelago is you and your network get together and just buy some fucking land. Actually and you own territory. And you own buildings and things, and now it's real. And it doesn't need to be one huge block of land. It could be several properties scattered throughout, but in aggregate, it represents one holistic territory. Which, again, to bring it back to Israel, Palestine, the Palestinians in the region are actually kind of spread out in different sections around that region, right? But they operate as one unit. So you could have a it doesn't need to be one boxed in area, is what he's saying. And then from there, you become a network state. After the network archipelago, become a network state. After you say, we've got this land we're taking seriously, you start trying to get recognition from other states, because that's really the end goal of a network state, is to take you from like an online community to something that's taken seriously by the UN. And what the book shows is like, that's actually not that difficult to do. He had said, he's like, you know what? Like, if you get a community of like 1 million people, he's like, that's around the size of most city states. Like most countries in the world aren't that big. It's like to have a seat at the table on the global stage, not like at the level of China or the US, but he's like, all that matters. We looked at this when we discussed neorealism, that really power is how much power people think you have. Power is just your ability to maintain your own sovereignty. So in a sense, like you being a state, all you need to do is convince other states to believe you're a state. And that's what's going on. That's what happens in North Korea. That's what's going on in Palestine. They're using it through military arms, but there's other cases of this, like even in like Canada with the Aboriginals. Like all you need to do to become an actual state is plead a case in a convincing way and have it accepted by other states. So how can you do that? And this book explores that. So he says like a big part of having an online a network state, probably the most important, because it keeps coming back to this, is having a blockchain census. He says as the society scales, you have to run a cryptographically cryptographically audible senses to demonstrate the growing size of your population, income, and real estate footprint. The key idea is to populate land from the cloud and to do so all over the earth. And you do this effectively through crowdfunding. And like you said, this is very much an ANCAP thing. And like, what's the ANCAP thing? Well, you would gather voluntary taxes and just buy real estate, and effectively everyone owns it. How you sort that out would be sorted out on the blockchain, according to him. Like, you could actually assign ownership on the blockchain. I tend to be skeptical of people who kind of just wave the blockchain around as a solution to every problem. It's like, well, how do you solve this? Well, just the blockchain will keep a record of it. There's one example he gives in the book about how the blockchain can solve I'm paraphrasing here, but how the blockchain can solve the problem of like blurry history that, throughout time we've had a difficult time accurately keeping track of events, but with the blockchain we could actually record events more accurately. And which is true, but my position is that we've never had a problem of recording events that happen. Events, just like wars and transactions, they've been recorded pretty accurately throughout time. What we disagree on is intent. What we disagree on is motivations and the machinations behind the scenes. But like, if it's just like, here's a war and this many people died, or this country was founded then, or this transaction occurred, like, we've done that with fucking parchment and papyrus since time immemorial. So it's not like the blockchain isn't even solving the problem of historical accuracy, because even with events recorded, there's still all this other smeared shit that's the stuff that we argue about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no one really argues whether Jesus Christ existed, right? And again, like, they recorded in the Bible the stuff that Jesus Christ was supposed to have done, and people still disagree on that. So if that was on the blockchain, there wouldn't be less disagreement about it, right? There's a line here that I really liked. Is America's religious colonies succeeded at a higher rate than its for-profit colonies. That's interesting, because the former had a purpose. You're arguing, when you start these colonies, that the culture of your startup society, he uses the word startup society a lot, is better than the surrounding culture. Implicitly, that means there's some moral deficit in the world that you're fixing. History comes into play because you need to write a study of that moral deficit and draw from the past to find alternative social arrangements where that moral deficit didn't occur. He has this line in the book that was interesting. He had said that, the politicians or the dissidents of today, they need to have an understanding of history just so they can wield it for their interests. And he said a lot of politicians in the past didn't have the command of history, but you actually need history to tell your story. It's only in service of telling your story, because, like you said, for a group to be effective, and I talk about this a bit on the Vanguardist Journal, it's like we talked about it even with the True State. We discussed that book, The True State, which says that anytime you join a group, you are in effect othering everyone who's not in that group, even if they're in the same society, even your family, even your clan. In some sense, you are saying that I am apart from them, and this is better than not being in here. And there's just like concentric circles of othering that goes on. And it says, to start a colony, even if you don't intend to, the strength of the colony is built on your strength to other everything else that's around it. And that, you don't need to be that explicit about it, but that does happen. Just like the religious colonies, like, tended to succeed more than the for-profit business capital oriented colonies in America. And he's got this one concept here, which I've mentioned before, and I'm not sure everyone likes it. I've had people pick it apart, but I still kind of like it. I feel like there's something there. He talks about how to start with this network. You start small, right? You don't start with a massive network. Just like, he gives the example of like Facebook or something. When a startup starts a social network, you start with a big infrastructure and then you fill it with people. What you need to do is do the opposite. You start with a few people and grow an entire apparatus around it. And he said, I'm going to try and summarize this as best as I can. Instead, where people go wrong is they start thinking, okay, we need 10 commandments. We need a list of rules that unite all of us. And And he said, the more rules you have to unite you, the less likely you are to be that cohesive and that unified. He's like, what you actually need is one commandment. Just one thing that unites everyone in that group, but it needs to be, and the simpler it is, the better. And the way he describes it sounds kind of silly, but I don't know. I just like it a lot. and I want to hear what you think about it, because he said the one commandment would be, for example, let's say you were trying to start like a Christian movement. It would just be Christianity good, right? Or if you're starting like a group, a fitness group, it's carbs bad. Something good, something bad. That's as simple as it needs to be. And that could actually unify people a lot more. So I started thinking about it, like, on our side, and it doesn't need to be the entire network. Like, for example, the dissident right, or on the other side, the progressives, they don't need to be seen as one network. Look at the dissident right and look at all the other smaller networks in it. There are smaller networks. There's, the traditional Catholics. There's like the Bronze Age pervert sphere. That would be like the vitalist guys. Then over here, there's just the Nazis. Then over here, there's, there's a multitude of networks of various sizes. And so, for example, the Nazis, like the guys from the NJP or the rightstuff.biz, they are a clear example of their thing is just Jews bad. And they would probably admit to that.
Yeah.
Everything is just Jews bad. If you think Jews are bad, you can be part of it.
To the extent that nothing else seems to matter.
Yeah, exactly. And then, the track has to be like Catholicism, good. As long as you believe in that, that's good. White nationalism would be white people good. In white nationalism, they have the 14 words, 1488. What are the 14 words? We must, I should know this, secure the existence for our people and a future for white children. And then 88 is Heil Hitler. That's a lot of words. You know what it also means? White people good. That actually cuts through. Honestly, some people might, scoff at me giving notes to that side of so explicitly, but I'm like, honestly, because I've seen guys, or some people, it's like they believe in the 14, but not the 88, or some people believe in the 88, but not the 14. And I'm like, you know what all you guys have in common? White people good.
Yeah,
that's it, right? As long as you believe that seems to cover. That's a more coherent umbrella you can exist under. So I've just started playing that game. I'm like looking at these networks, or thinking of a network that, whether it's in stark opposition to something or just in stark favor of something, because you can build a city on the hill with one commandment. You know what I mean? It doesn't need to be this complicated scheme. And I started thinking, like, what would that be for our group? Because some people it's just technology bad. For, anarchists, government, state, bad, it seems the ones with the most coherence are the ones with that one commandment. So I think that's just a fun thought experiment for people to run, like, And then once you have enough of those separate networks, then you can start creating a network of networks and seeing which networks actually pair together. And that's what we were talking about with the square and the square and the tower, which is that successful revolutions are done by taking these disparate networks and finding super nodes between them that can kind of coordinate them to a common action. But it's never generated from within the networks themselves. The networks just have one goal, to try and like be a sort of community state thing. And then almost through some other force or phenomena, they can gather towards a shared target, a shared other. And that's what a revolution is. And that's why these things tend to fall apart after the revolution succeeds. And he's got a line in here that I think summarizes his position from a technological point of view. He says, God is dead and replaced by the state. Now the state is dead. And that God used to be the most powerful force on earth that controlled people's actions, that was responsible for their fears, that was responsible for what they think is good. And God, we're not going to get into that, but God is dead, replaced by the state. The state defines what you're afraid of. That you feel like the state is watching you. You feel like the state is the moral arbiter in your life. A lot of people feel this very viscerally. But people also feel like the state is dead. The state is in crisis. No one really trusts the government. So he says, what is the most powerful force in the world now? Now he says encryption. He says the network is the next Leviathan. Leviathan in the sense of Thomas Hobbes as the next great beast that can represent, the human spirit in that sense. And I think there's something to that, and it will use encryption, and this is where the technology comes in, where it thinks, well, we can harness the blockchain to almost have a new type of society, a new type of government. Now, I'm sure he will say that this will eventually consign states as we know them to the dustbin of history. I don't think that's going to happen, but what I like about the book is it's presenting a practical model for dissident movements of any political stripe, really, to start to figure out what's the next step. What do you move towards? Like, we have a group, and we believe in something. Maybe we believe all in the same thing. What now?
Why would you want re-centralization? We're talking about taking power away from these totally illegitimate establishments with Bitcoin. We're talking about breaking the state and defunding the government and so on. We're giving them defunding the police. We're defunding everything, right? And we're talking about breaking these tyrannies and getting away from the surveillance state. Why would you ever want to rebuild something like that, right? So the thing is that re-centralization has the smallest constituency right now, but I think it's the right constituency. And the reason is, I believe, one of the things I point out in the book is the helical theory of history. So the linear theory of history is we're just progressing. We're just improving. We're getting more equal. We're leveling up. Everything's getting better, and so on and so forth. There's something to be said for this. On some axes, on some measures, humans have been improving. Like our knowledge of math, for example, that is like a roughly cumulative chart. It has drops when you have the dark ages and stuff like that. It's not all the way up to it, but it's like up and to the right. Okay. Then you have the cyclical theory of history, which is, and actually one of the things I talk about in the book is both the left and a right and a libertarian cycle of history. But the right cycle of history is strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men, where it's basically like,
this is the foreturning, right?
Yeah. So it's Nietzschean band of Spartans. They go and build a great society, and then these degenerates take it down, and then, we have to, like, from the chaos and ashes, rebuild again, and so on, right? What's funny is the left has their own version of this, which is the zealous revolutionaries manage to fight the man and overthrow it, and then a Stalin-like figure comes and compromises the revolution, and the new boss is the same as the old boss, and then it comes back to this, right? And then the tech libertarian has a version that's also like this, which is the startup founder goes and rebels against the bureaucracy. They manage to build an operational thing that is actually much more egalitarian, and it's got a flatter hierarchy and takes care of all the bureaucracy, and it's actually more competitive. And then what happens is the bureaucracy encrusts this, and the libertarian founder rebuilds the state, right? And one of the points I make is all three of those cycles are the same cycle, because it's not just the right cycle of being like strong, and it's not just the left cycle of being zealous, and it's not just the libertarian cycle of having an innovation. You kind of need all of those at the same time to actually go all the way around the cycle to fight that establishment.
He's got this line here. He says, if the startup founders of the 2000s and 2010s had to level up beyond technology to learn business, which is kind of like the startup auteur was, then the startup society founders of the 2020s need to add history and politics to their curriculum. He says, because a theory of the left and right is necessary for nation formation. You can't just start a nation without understanding the necessity of the left and the right. Now, what does he mean by that? And he describes in the book, and I've heard this described elsewhere too, and I was talking to John Talley about this the other day.
Yeah.
A lot of people have remarked that, America's got a two-party system, the left and the right. Isn't that stupid? We've said that in Canada, and in Britain and elsewhere, we think our parliamentary system is more enlightened because we have more parties. When in reality, all those parties seem to fall upon the left-right axis. In Canada, we still have left and right. It's just some are far more left than others. It seems that the two hemispheres of left and right seem to manifest no matter the political system. And what does that mean? So we define the left as almost the revolutionary side and the right as the conservative side. And these two poles always exist, but they tend to be filled with different ideologies at a given time. But it seems that across time, there's always a conservative side on law and order and stasis and tradition, and there's always the revolutionary side. And sometimes that wins, and sometimes the revolution occurs, but then they become the conservative side. And then almost by necessity, it creates its own shadow. It creates its own revolution to the revolution. You know, that interestingly enough, that's where you get Napoleon after the French Revolution. The shadow of the French Revolution was Napoleon. And you see and it's always there. It's always just, and I think there's almost like a natural law component to this that you can't even say is based on ideology. It's just any left and right, good, evil, black, white. It's just nature seems, even though it seems man-made, it's more evident that nature seems to bifurcate. And I don't know what to do with that information. It's just, he mentions it, and he mentions that if you want to start a state, you need to recognize that the left-right dichotomy isn't something you can innovate your way out of. That's where a lot of tech guys think that we're going to get rid of this two-party system. Like, no. That's why you need to understand history and politics, because if you understood history and politics, you realize that the left-right dichotomy is essential to any state, even if it's a new network state. But you got to figure out what you're going to do about that. Even fascism tried to like think its way out of that.
Hey, do you remember we talked very briefly about the book series, The Three Body Problem? And this is not related to the book, but we're just describing what the three body problem is. It's essentially if you have two bodies orbiting each other in space, you can predict how they will interact with each other. They have a one-to-one reaction. But if you add a third body, you essentially can't calculate it. It's not something that you can work on. What you can do is you take the first two, you calculate them, use them as a unit. Now you've synthesized that, you use that as unit C, and then you can compare that to the other one. But you're always only ever working with two units. And it's kind of the same thing. Like if you had three parties, what's going to happen is one of them will become subsumed with another, and you're back to two parties. Like it's always going to wind up being one versus another.
Exactly. And I think that an idea that kind of plagues our side even still is like, when will we get out of this old way of thinking? And I'm like, no, I think it's nature, it's the universe, it's God, it's whatever you want to call it. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in the fact of it's the yin and the yang. There's something there that I don't think you can innovate your way out of. And he says revolutionary tactics eventually succeed in gaining power for one tribe, and ruling class tactics eventually fail to defend power from another tribe. So the left and the right gradually switch over historical timescales, even as the tribal names remain the same. So, and he says that another way to look at it is like the left mentality is more for like action and innovation, and the right is more for administration. And you kind of need both. And what they're always trying to destroy each other. And this sounds like a middle of the road centrist take. Here's centrist dives. But really, like, if you want to look at it from a Hegelian point of view, like that's the tension of society between both of these poles is what society is. Society is the tension between these two opposing forces. And society exists in that perfect stasis as long as they are kept in balance. You know, the revolutionary. And we talked about that with the true state just a couple episodes ago. You know, the conflict between universalism and individualism, where individualism is too revolutionary, too selfish, too crazy and chaotic. But you need that chaos because the universalist society is too static. You know, it's ruins forever. You know, it doesn't evolve, it doesn't innovate. So you can't have that. And a lot of people on the right, the traditionalists, will be like, well, you know, we can just return to that perfect stasis. We can never have a perfect stasis. That doesn't make any sense. So it's trying to reconcile those two things. I like this book is factoring that in. And he kind of summarizes it here. He says, putting it all together, we propose that A, left and right are quantifiable phenomena we can see via the spatial theory of voting. B, the left-right axis is real but rotates with time. C, they're ancient and ineradicable concepts, arguably on par with yin and yang or magnetic north and south. D, they're complementary tactics to gain access to scarce resources. E, if one group uses a left tactic, the other is almost forced to adopt a right tactic in response, and vice versa. F, the frontier reduces political left-right issues because it reduces conflict over scarce resources. So he was also talking about the idea of the frontier, how the frontier is essential. And once he says that, like, that the left-right dichotomy tends to maximize when you're, you know, experiencing scarce resources and you're in a confined space. But if there's always a frontier to expand out into, It tends to mediate a lot of these conflicts, which it seemed to do in the past. G, we can think of left as revolutionary tactics and right as ruling class tactics. And H, the tactics constantly swap hosts over historical time frames. He gives an example of a network society just to give people just something to go off of on a smaller scale. He calls it the cancel-proof society. And he says one solution is just a network union that provides a combination of A, a guild, and B, cancellation insurance. He says you assemble a group of people in a Discord. All right, you're already not liking it, but okay. Optionally, take a stake in each other by using a DAO token, there's the blockchain stuff comes in, and work together to promote each other's work and help each other out. The token of the DAO would be optional. It wouldn't be meant to be some massive new thing like Ethereum. It's just a way to record who contributed time and or money to the startup society and how much they did. The concept is that this kind of startup society serves a dual purpose. It's useful in peacetime, but also gives people a community to fall back on in the event of digital cancellation. Which is funny he said this, because this is something that we were talking about months ago. Like I was phrasing it in a much more reductive way, but it was like, what if we use like a blockchain on our side of things, in the dissident right, whatever you want to call it, so people like a blockchain, because you know how blockchain works, you can just track transactions. So if you had your wallet would be your online identity, your nom de plume, whatever screen name you want, you don't need to use your real name, but it would be a permanent wallet and record of how much work you put in to the dissident right. Now, what could that be? Well, that could be you went to a protest. That could be you did a podcast. That could be you helped someone out with a project. You put some work. You did something. Maybe you opened up your house to have someone who's traveling stay with you while they're doing a show somewhere. So even if you're not a big famous influencer, you're still that sort of super node who maybe has been putting work in for years and helping people out and connecting people. Now you have a measurable like wallet about all the work you put in that acts as your rep, that acts as your vetting, you're someone. And that means like you're someone who should be reckoned with in a way that's not like, it's not notoriety. It's not you looking for clout. And so that's something I thought like, hey, can we get that together because there's a lot of guys in our scene who help out, who do a lot of work, and they don't want to be famous, but it'd be nice with some kind of recognition if someone's out there doing like free production work or free, thumbnails for images. Think of a thing you could do. So I liked this because it stole my idea that I didn't tell anyone about except like you and a couple others. And he mentions that the group of people who would be most attracted to this, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but I want to mention it anyway. It's called the International Intermediate. The International Intermediate, they're just the people who don't want their societies to descend into what he calls American anarchy, but also want a better option than Chinese control. That he said that's funny enough. He says that's India and Israel, but also American centrists, Chinese liberals, global technologists, and people from other places that want to steer a different course from the U.S. establishment.
Here's my thesis on like globalization, deglobalization, etc. First is I think globalization continues online, but it goes in reverse offline. So you have like physical nationalism, but you have digital globalization. And that's actually the tension of this century. It is the cloud versus the land. Mm-hmm. You have this global community of, remote working, because on the one hand, you've got all these trends pushing towards total internationalism, right? You have cryptocurrency, you have remote work, you have Starlink, you have this massive global community of startup entrepreneurs and folks who are more connected than they've ever been. You have encryption, which is cross borders. You have, you have all of those things. You have the metaverse coming. You have billions of people with smartphones. You have transnational companies. All of those are huge pushes on the digital side for continued globalization and accelerated, in fact, in some ways. On the other hand, you have the land pushing against that, where various countries, various politicians want to retain their control over their jurisdiction. They want to use the state against the network, right? And so it's actually more complicated than simply deglobalization. This is a political axis of, state versus network.
It's kind of describing how the average person experiences having like multiple identities online. He says, if you take a sample of biological fluid from your body and you centrifuge it, you'll see a bunch of layers that were previously mixed together. That's what a centrifuge does. They all get separated out. And he says that's what the internet is doing to society and institutions. It unbundles everything and reduces people to like a collection of identities and maximizes those identities. And you've seen that even with like political affiliations and fetishes and everything. And he says then comes the rebundling. That's kind of where we're at right now. We've unbundled all of our stuff. Now it's rebundling it. He says that's where songs get grouped into playlists. I liked that metaphor. We destroyed the album, but we've allowed people to create these really distinct playlists from the component parts. The articles grouped into Twitter feeds. He says that's kind of the way he's looking at how we can like reshuffle these identities that still matter, but kind of reconfigure them in new ways, and that the internet would allow us to do that in ways that we couldn't before if we were just tied to geographic area. And that could be good or that could be bad, but that is the reality. And I'm just going to end on this. I'm going to go through this list because I think this is a good way to end on it. It really summarizes it very non-confusedly, in case I haven't been clear. So he says, what do you need to be a network state? Here's the list of what you need, full on. First of all, you need a social network. The people of the network state form their nation online. Social rather than geographic proximity is the core organizing principle. Admission to the social network is selective. People can lose their account privileges for bad behavior, just like any online community. And he made a comment earlier that the network state is constant plebiscite. Like you're always trying to like monitor who's inside of it based on affiliation. The next is you need a moral innovation. A network state grows out of a startup society that is premised on a moral innovation where everyone within that society thinks some principle, whatever the principle is, principle X, is good, and that the rest of the world thinks it's bad, or vice versa. This is the proposition part of a propositional nation. And it's up to your community, your network state, to figure out what that is. A sense of national consciousness is the next part. Everyone in a network state feels that they're part of the same community, sharing the same values and culture. And this is why he also says that there should be certain behaviors that are tolerated. Some of this, will occur over time. You'll notice that in a lot of networks, even in the dissident right or on the left or anywhere, once you're in these networks, you'll notice that certain behaviors, they're not outright stated that they're intolerable. It's just you notice people use certain words, or they're more polite than other places, and that's it. That part's very important, having a distinct social character. And how does that happen? Well, the next part is you need a recognized founder. A state, like a company, needs a leader, especially early on. But a truly strong leadership comes from consent and buy-in, not propaganda or force. Hence, it's important that you have a recognized founder, one that people actually listen to and choose to follow by joining the community. So, and this could also be the person who sets the tone for behavior. And it does, you'll just notice this if you're part of these communities that exist now. You'll notice that they tend to group around one person who sets the at least conversational tone. So imagine that, but amplify it. The next thing is you need a capacity for collective action. This is tightly related to the concept of national consciousness. The Puritans wanted to build a city on the hill. The Japanese, after the Meiji Restoration, replaced their previous mission statement of revere the emperor, expel the barbarians with enrich the country, strengthen the military, turning their society around 180 degrees. The next thing is you need an in-person level of civility. That's kind of what I was just mentioned. Whether one is coming from the left or right, pulling together in a high-trust society means in-person levels of civility. That's very important. And that's something I think we kind of struggle with on the right because we like having fights. We like being rude. We like being shitty to each other. I'm as guilty of this as anyone. That's one aspect of a community that I don't think we've really mastered, which is, if not, Elizabethan England levels of civility, but some kind of civility to each other, where we're not just shit posting. Right. The next thing is an integrated cryptocurrency. He says this is the digital backbone of the network state. It manages the internal digital assets, the smart contracts, the Web3 citizen logins, the birth and marriage certificates, the property registries, everything. It replaces all the other bureaucratic paper. The next thing is an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories. We discussed this. This is the physical footprint of the network state. Rather than buying territory in one place or trying to negotiate sovereignty up front, you build the community in the cloud and then crowdfund physical real estate on Earth. He says a consensual government is next, limited by a smart social contract. In practice, we say that a user has consented to be governed by a startup society. And he also has some stuff in here which I'm sure people wouldn't agree with. Basically, it's that to do something like this, you are granting total power to the network state as well. You know what I mean? Like within the network state, there almost seems to be no form of anarchy, because at least in a state, a state as we know it, you could have breakaway parallel societies. You could have dark corners where you get your own thing going. It's assumed that in a network state, everything is transparent, everything is trackable. As a citizen, you almost give full power to the network state itself. So if you are an anarchist-minded person or a libertarian-minded person, you can talk about consent and transparency all you want, but there is something to be said that within this state there is no dissidence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You cannot have a dissident movement within a network state. So I don't know. That's something to consider. You need to have a virtual capital. Kind of. He says you should have a capital city based in VR. That sounds kind of gay. I don't want to do that.
Very gay.
The next thing is an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate, and then you use that to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. Diplomatic recognition requires a putative state to have clout, and clout in turn established by a publicly verifiable on-chain census. So that, I'll leave it right there. That is essentially what the network state is. That is how it functions. That is how you build one step by step. There's more granular steps we can get into, but it shows how you go from just the community to the archipelago to the actual state. I was just wondering, what do you think of all that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. This is kind of the bones of how I would like to organize things. Look, I'm in it, kind of an ANCAP, so I get where they're coming from with this. So it's good. I like it.
Yeah, if there's parts that I don't like about it or I'm not as excited about, it would be the technical side. It would be the focus on the blockchain. It would be the full transparency, and it would be, the idea that on a long enough timeline, I bet they would integrate AI into this. I'm not, it would come to pass that the network state might very well have all the negative attributes of the current surveillance state. And maybe you won't mind that as long as the state might be your interests.
That would be one of my big critiques too, is like the reliance on technology. It's like, oh, well, what if the group that you're part of happens to think that most or a lot of modern technologies do more harm than good? Then maybe this isn't going to work. But I think the point is there's the kind of the bones of this from an organizational standpoint don't really rely on technology. They're just made more convenient by technology. So you could do this on paper. You could do this with snail mail. It doesn't have to be on the blockchain. It doesn't even require the internet, technically. The other thing I'm not really sure about is the whole unbundling and rebundling, like manually, like consciously. I think this is similar to technology. What did you lose by taking those bundles apart? And is it something you're capable of putting back together? It's like a child taking apart a radio, and then you're hoping it works when they put it back together. It usually doesn't. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and just to bring this back to the start, this is in effect what a lot of the Islamic world is doing. Just to your point, it doesn't need to have a blockchain. You could have a decentralized affiliation network that hits a lot of these marks. It owns the land. It has its backup data. It controls itself. It's not necessarily tied to any geographic area, and it is just as effective. And to the even earlier point, this is the germs of these intellectual movements and these revolutions also follow this. And arguably, this was like America started off like this too, as a decentralized revolutionary network that eventually it didn't crowd fund anything on a blockchain, but it functioned like this. So it is possible to do this without the technology. The question is, even if you don't want to use AI and blockchain or whatever, what other technology could you plug into this to make it into a distinctly 21st century decentralized movement? So that would maybe your opinion of internet online identities is different than this guy. So you could take this framework and adopt it to a lot of different modes. That's my belief anyway. That's what I hope people take from it.
No, that's cool.
And knowing that a lot of the conflicts we see in the world now kind of are between decentralized multi-state networks.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.